Hi, everybody. Apologies for the delay, just a few technical issues, but we are going to get started. So my name is Andy. It's my privilege to be introducing today's provocation speaker. His name is Keston Perry. He is an economics lecturer and also a writer on climate justice, finance, and development. Today's talk is titled Colonialism and the Climate Crisis. Me personally, I'm super intrigued to learn more. Having a little chat with Keston before starting, he said the talk was going to be very provocative and it was going to be things that people won't be as familiar or potentially haven't come across before. So I'm even more intrigued than I was before. I would like to say, if you do have any questions during the talk, feel free to post them in the Q&A and we'll get to those questions at the end. I'll also be to ask your questions. And here's the man himself. Thank you very much, Keston.
Hi.
Thanks for joining us. Super privileged to have you on here. So hopefully things are okay with your presentation with the technical troubles. I'm going to give you the floor and jump off for now, and I'll join you again at the end, and we'll tackle some of these questions.
Sure.
Cheers.
Thank you very much, Andy. My presentation seemed to not have been loaded, but what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk to some of the issues here so that we can get a sense of why I link colonialism and the process of the system of colonialism to the climate crisis and what that means for our present scenario in addressing. So I think now you can see the presentation. Okay. So I've come across this issue first, let me introduce a bit about what I do and what I've done. I'm a lecturer in economics at the University of the West of England, Bristol, and my work addresses how social groups, marginalized groups have come to exercise agency and transform their societies. And this is what led me to this particular issue on colonialism and climate crisis. As a postdoc at Tufts University, I engaged in work on climate investments in Haiti and more or less quantifying the amount of resources and development aid that went into addressing issues around energy and climate change in Haiti, as Haiti is 2017 was one of the top 3 countries most vulnerable in the entire world to climate change. And in terms of today's talk, I'm going to give a brief primer about what colonialism is and how it links to climate change and what we can gather from a historical perspective in terms of how the process of colonialism has generated and increased the level of vulnerability that many countries face in the world today. After that, I'm going to share a bit about what we might call the great colonial powers and what role they had in generating and producing greenhouse gas emissions. So I'm using greenhouse gas emissions as the metric to understand countries that have contributed the most to the climate crisis. And after which I'm going to share a bit about flows, about climate finance. So climate finance is a new area of finance that countries have been, especially OECD countries and a number of emerging countries have contributed to addressing the issue of climate change. And it has come into the fold since 2010, when we had and 2015, actually, when we had the Paris Agreement. So climate finance has been one of those categories of finance that has come to the fore over the past few years, at least within the last decade or so. And then I'm going to show you a bit of how I connect the colonized, or the countries that have been colonized, and their vulnerability to climate change. And I'm going to show you a couple examples, and I'm going to end with what I consider the solution given the configuration of these various dimensions and the issue around power relations that affect countries' ability to address climate change. So for many of you, you might or might not have come across or engaged with historically in your history lessons or in historical studies about colonialism. Some of you may have. And how I have come to define colonialism, and this is not, I guess, in recent history, in recent past few months, we have come, especially with the fall of the statue in Bristol, we've been engaging in discussion in a very, I suppose, publicly, in a very superfluous way in terms of what slavery has meant and what the process that followed slavery, that is colonialism, what that has meant in terms of generating certain kinds of structural inequalities in the world, and certain kinds of, be it economic, be it cultural, and certain kinds of ideas about what slavery and colonialism has meant in the world today, even though that system supposedly ended in the 19th century, there are still legacies of colonialism that affect us today. And that's the connection that I'm making to climate change. So I define colonialism as a system of violent exploitation and extraction of environmental and other resources by a foreign power that subjugates and or utilizes people's identity, culture, intellect, and labor for the former's benefit. So this shows you a kind of relationship between the colonized and the colonizer, and the one having certain amount of structural and relative power over the other in terms of resources. And this extraction of resources in terms of climate change has meant the environmental degradation. It has meant depletion of resources in many parts of the world, especially in the global south, which have been party to the process of colonialism. And Frantz Fanon, in a discussion on Frantz Fanon, who is one of the main scholars and activists addressing the issue of colonialism, Stanford has suggested that in that relationship, there's the worker who offers labor, not for, in this particular regime, not for any serious amount of earnings. They offer their labor to the colonizer, and is organized, that process of colonialism is organized around the capacity of that worker to work. And it's a complicated relationship, in part because is dependent upon the colonizer for material needs. And as part of that colonial system, the material needs are supplied by the colonizer. And naturally, there's a revolutionary sentiment or spirit that the colonized has to tap into in order to face up to their colonized status. And being exploited in that particular kind of relationship means that there's an instinct to address it, and there's an instinct to resist. And we've seen that in the in the history of Haiti in particular, which became the first Black republic to extricate itself to free itself and liberate itself from French colonialism. And especially Frantz Fanon addressed colonialism in the context of Algeria, which had led Algerians had led serious resistance and violent resistance against the French as well. And second, there's the colonized intellectual, who is supposedly a compromised figure, who plays a crucial role in relation to informing that process of resistance and political resistance. And the colonized intellectual mediates that relationship between the colonized and the colonizers. So in the Caribbean and in the West Indies, there were a number of people who were considered intellectuals. So we can look at people like many in the West probably know about Arthur Lewis, who was a serious figure in economics and development economics, who made a number of representations to Great Britain at the time in order to start the development process in Great Britain, especially after the 1930s. This was during colonialism, especially after the 1930s, where there were a number of riots after the Second World War, in particular, a number of riots that contributed to Great Britain suggesting that, it had to put forward a number of concessions in order for Great Britain to maintain its colonies in the West Indies in particular. And how I'm linking colonialism to climate change is the fact that there have been a number of recent studies that show unplanned systems of land use, energy extraction. Great Britain, at one point in time, Trinidad provided at about 60%, Trinidad and Tobago, that's a small island in the Caribbean region. It was actually very important to Great Britain, and it provided about 60% of the energy needs of Great Britain. So imagine this very small country, which now at that time had a very small population and now has a population of about 1.4 million people, provided most of the energy needs for Great Britain. And that process of colonialism meant that things like trains and train systems and rail systems had to be established and had to be erected in order for the extraction of resources to happen and for those resources to be exported. So you had a number of ports that were created and so on, to be exported for the oil and other resources to be exported to Great Britain and Western Europe at that particular point in time. And that process meant that you had to go into a number of practices. So farming practices, plantation, agriculture was a major part of, especially sugar in the West Indies, and in the southern United States, you had a number of other commodities like cotton and so on, and coffee that had to be extracted in order to satisfy demand in the Western Europe and other parts of the world. And so this meant that there were a number of environmental impositions, and that contributed to environmental degradation. It contributed to resource exploitation and overuse, and that also had a very major part to play in destabilizing the relationship between human beings and human society with the environment. And so that's how I'm connecting colonialism to climate change, as that degradation over 2 or 3 centuries that happened in that process of colonialism contributed, at least since I will show you a slide in a subsequent slide that shows you, since the 18th and 19th century, to the increase in greenhouse gas emissions and increase in surface temperatures that had an important part in contributing to today what we know as the climate crisis and climate change. So this particular slide shows us the frequency of a number of extreme environmental events that has increased significantly after the 1960s in a number of regions that were former colonies. So we're looking at the Caribbean region, which would, I know it's this slide, I wanted to show you this slide because it shows you how messed up the number of disasters, droughts, extreme events, storms and floods have how it has happened since the 1960s, and how a number of countries face, especially the Caribbean region. So you would see there that blue, bright blue line here. That's 2017, where we had two major Category 5 hurricanes. That's Irma, we had Harvey, and we had Maria, Hurricane Maria. And Central America is also a major region. So we're seeing that orange line here that shows you the number of those events have increased significantly throughout a number of those regions: South America, Western Africa, Eastern Europe, which was colonized by Russia, and so on. Southern Africa, which seems to be on the lower end in terms of the number of events. So Southern Africa, I'm going to show you the example of Mozambique in 2019 that experienced two major cyclones as well. So this shows you how over time the climate crisis has worsened, and how these countries in particular have felt, who have been former colonies, have felt the brunt and have faced the disproportionate number of these extreme events over time. And I wanted to show you this particular graph as it shows us over time. So I started with showing you the process of colonialism that started since the 15th century. So we're looking at 15th century up until the mid 20th century. So that's about 500 years or so, five centuries. And the countries that this graph shows you that have contributed the most to greenhouse gas emissions in the world historically have been Europe. So it is no coincidence, Europe and the United States. So it's no coincidence that Europe, which has been, so we have Portugal, we have the Netherlands, we have Great Britain, we have France, Germany, which also colonized a number of countries in Africa, and we have Italy. So Europe has been that region that has contributed the second most number in terms of cumulative contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. Europe contributed about 22%, according to this particular data point. 22% of greenhouse gas emissions globally since the 18th century have come from Europe. The United States, which has also been a former colonizing force and an imperial power, have contributed about 5%, and its own 25% of greenhouse gas emissions since that period. So I think there's been a lot of discussion recently around China being the major contributor that surpassed the United States to greenhouse gas emissions, but that only happened in 2002. So only since 2002 that China has been the largest contributor to the United States. And we can see the other countries, other regions of the world have contributed a lot less. This also shows you here, this particular map shows us that the two regions or regions of the world that have been the largest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions or CO2 emissions have been the United States. Here we can see on the left-hand side, the dark red, the United States and Russia as well, dark red, but Europe as well also has a very dark color from that region, and it represents the second largest, as I mentioned, contributor. So since the 2010 or so, as I mentioned, we have been accounting for the amount of climate finance that have gone to countries, especially to developing and vulnerable countries, to address mitigation, which means to reducing the amount of greenhouse gas emissions, and adaptation, which means to trying to more or less adapt to the reality that climate change is here, and it is affecting countries in terms of a number of devastating effects. Hurricanes, we're talking about coastal erosion, soil degradation, effects on agriculture, and so on. And the largest amount of finance over the past few years have gone to mitigation. And this is because the countries that have been contributing to mitigation efforts have been countries in sort of advanced economies, industrialized economies. And since the Paris Agreement, a lot of focus have been placed on mitigation in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The issue with the amount of funds that so we're seeing $537 billion have gone to mitigation in 2007 and 2018. And the problem is that climate change is here already, and countries affected and most vulnerable are countries in the global south, are the poorer countries, low-income countries, but also island nation states. And so how the funding have been divided up is based on the priorities and based on the power that the largest industrialized countries have in putting those funds forward, but also designing them and also determining where those funds go. Right, that shows us the very disproportionate way that climate finance has been divided. Adaptation obviously go towards countries that are facing the largest effects to climate change, and mitigation often go to countries that want to. So many people have this idea that we're going to solve the climate crisis by increasing renewable energies. That is, in my view, a small part of how we solve the climate crisis. Many countries are already facing the most devastating effects of the climate crisis, and so they need funds and resources to actually adapt to those changes. It is not just that we need to reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions. Countries also need to actually live with that reality, because it's going to be there with them for many years. In addition to that, I wanted to point out from this that actually since 2015, because countries have already been facing a number of loss and damage to anthropogenic climate change, there's actually no budgetary and line item or international financial mechanism that go towards compensating countries which have faced losses. And so if we can connect the fact that countries that have the most industrialized countries have contributed the most to the climate crisis, we must also connect the fact that countries connect that to the fact that countries that are facing the most losses and damage as a result of climate change should receive some level of resources. However, the United States in 2015, when we had the Paris Accord, opposed any sort of compensation or any sort of financial contribution towards losses and damage that countries are already facing from the climate crisis. And I wanted to put the historical scenario into perspective. So I talked about climate colonialism and what that meant and how that connects to the climate crisis through a number of different mechanisms. So many people may actually say that colonialism was a long time ago and we are now in a new world and countries are free and sovereign and so on. But I wanted to put this into perspective and make the connection between these are a number of the most vulnerable countries to the climate crisis based on studies that have shown countries that face the frequency of disasters and events. And to show you how colonialism links to climate change and climate crisis, these countries have only been, in terms of Bangladesh, have only been actually independent since 1947. So if we consider 1947 to the present, that's just over 50 years. Climate change has been, greenhouse gas emissions, as I showed in an earlier graph, have been accumulating in the atmosphere since the 18th century. So the amount of time that these countries have been independent is way shorter than the amount of time that greenhouse gas emissions have been accumulating in the air. So if we look at Haiti, it has been one of the most affected countries and have faced since 1804, although it became independent in 1804, have faced a number of incursions on its sovereignty, a number of violent occupation, for instance, in the early 20th century by the United States for about 15, 16 years, and that contributed to major corporations extracting wealth from Haiti. If we look at Philippines, which has been only independent from the United States, which was the colonizing power there, since 1946, and Haiti in the Southeast Asian Peninsula is one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change. Similarly, Vietnam, only independent since 1975. And if we look at the last column on the right, you can see this is the index that shows countries that are most vulnerable. So the higher the number in terms of ranking, so is the most vulnerable it is to climate change. So Bangladesh has a huge 146, Vietnam, as I show you, 119, Haiti 155. So these countries also have faced the largest costs in terms of climate change. If we show you a period of 20 years or so, Bangladesh over $2 billion in loss and damage. Haiti again, $418 million in loss and damage. Philippines over $2.8 billion in loss and damage. Vietnam over $2.2 billion in loss and damage. So the connection that we can make is clear. Countries that have faced the brunt of the climate change have been independent, and the processes of colonialism continued after independence. Let me make that clear. In terms of the amount of extraction of minerals, the amount of extraction of resources, agriculture, and so on, that transnational corporations, especially from Great Britain, especially from United States and other Western European powers, many of these companies come from these countries, have participated in the extraction even after independence happened. and thus have contributed to making these countries very vulnerable to climate change. So this is my second to last slide. And I wanted to show you these two examples I've written about most recently. The Bahamas 2019 Hurricane Dorian hit the Bahamas about 40 hours. This was a Category 5 hurricane. This is the most devastating hurricane that any country can face. And that generated losses and damage that amounted to just about $3.5 billion. And this is conservative estimates because the estimates don't always consider non-economic costs. So costs in terms of disruption, it costs in terms of disruption to health services or disruption to educational services, public services that many of these the country would need in order to get back on its feet. And this had also an effect in terms of increasing the public debt in the Bahamas. So, as I mentioned, there is no international financial mechanism for loss and damage at present. And at least funding line item that receives funding towards loss and damage. And it's based on a charitable basis that many countries put out pledges to get aid and support to address some of the loss that they have faced as a result of hurricanes and disasters, climate-induced disasters. And, you know, many of these countries go cap in hand often, but it is not their fault that they have become so exposed to the climate crisis. It is, as I mentioned, a process of colonialism. It's also a process of extraction that many of the countries have faced, that have, but that have put them into this situation. But they have also been put in a situation of increased debt. And, you know, the International Monetary Fund have said in a recent report that it cannot, apart from, in some instances, not in all instances, there is some debt relief that is put forward to address part of the loss that countries face. But often these countries actually have to generate more debt from agencies like the International Monetary Fund, from international financiers, from the international capital market. And since Hurricane Dorian only 1 year ago, but the Bahamas have racked up $300 million in debt. So it is it's a system of injustice that we have to face. Countries that are, especially countries that are most vulnerable, they have to face in order to get themselves back in working mode, get people back out to work, get people to receive supplies and address their needs after in terms of recovery needs and relief needs and so on. And so it is a very unjust kind of system if you want to look at it in that way. Mozambique similarly experienced cyclones Idai and Kenneth. This made major news back in 2019. Up to about $4 billion in loss and damage, estimated conservatively. Its debt has increased by over $2 billion. So if we look at a system where the major industrialized countries have contributed the most to greenhouse gas emissions, and if we look at it in terms of another metric, increased surface temperature. So the United States is number one in terms of contributing to increase in surface temperature based on a study by Climate Analytics. And Europe, again, is second in terms of increased surface temperature. So if we look at those two metrics, contribution to greenhouse gas emissions and increase in surface temperature contributions, and we look at the other side of the coin where the most vulnerable countries are in the developing world or global south, are facing increased debt, it shows you a very unjust economic system and a very unjust global economic system, in that many of these countries have to pay back these debts every year through servicing costs and through in terms of meeting the principal on that debt. Countries should not have to pay for a problem that they did not create. And that is the point I want to make in this presentation. And if that is the only message that you receive from today's talk, countries should not, especially the most vulnerable countries in the global south, should not have to increase their debt burdens, should not have to increase their costs in terms of relief and recovery in order to survive, because it is a matter of survival. In the case of the Bahamas, in the case of countries like Antigua and Barbuda, Barbuda in 2017 was completely wiped out. This is the smaller island of Antigua and Barbuda. And I think Richard Branson has an island in the U.S. Virgin Islands, has bought an island in the U.S. Virgin Islands. And so we have these countries which are home to the richest people and the most famous people in the world, have also have not benefited from that kind of wealth that many of these rich and famous people have come to make their homes and so on. So it is a continuing process of colonialism, even though it ended, we can say it ended in the mid 20th century, only over 50 years ago in many instances. Colonialism lasted over 500 years. So there is an unjust system that we need to address, and we need to address it in terms of compensation to countries that face the brunt and disproportionate effects of climate change. And this, for me, the solution to this is climate reparations, which is a system, policy framework, and a philosophical consideration around climate justice, and constitutes a program that contributes compensation and offers compensation for loss and damage as a result of climate change due to loss in terms of livelihoods, infrastructure, life chances, people having to experience increased debt and experience loss of income over a period of time due to ecological breakdown that date back to the mid-18th century. And this is due in part to the uptick in greenhouse gas emissions that have been locked into the system over a couple centuries. And we are seeing a large part of those effects since the 21st century. So climate reparations are also quantifiable in terms of monetary value. We can quantify it in terms of the loss and damage that countries face. And so we can attribute funds and resources based on those losses. And it also increases the amount of vulnerability that these countries face, and vulnerability to ecological crisis and to climate crisis. So we can count how much these countries are due. To some extent, it's not perfect. And to some degree, there have been reports around loss and damage and quantifying loss and damage. So there is some data about how much is due to these countries. And we can also consider, as part of climate reparations, non-economic losses that are not quantifiable due to the long history of exploitation, extraction of resources, environmental harm, and injury that have been aggravated by the extensive losses, especially to countries that are racialized, have large Black and indigenous populations. And this, as I mentioned, the process of colonialism was a racialized system in addition to an extractive system. And so we can think about what is due to these countries, but what is due based on a system of justice to meet the demands of the 21st century and meet the demands that the climate crisis has wrought on these countries. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Keston. Yeah, super interesting, and yeah, shocking, some of the graphs. I see why you're eager to make sure people saw some of these graphs and statistics. Is surprising and very concerning. So we're gonna jump straight into the Q&A. I would say please do continue to ask questions, but also please use the upvote feature. So if there's a particular question you want to hear, we might not get time to go through them all. So upvote the ones that you most want to be asked. So thank you, somebody who did that there. Let us start with Edna. So Edna says, most of the countries get aid, but their natural resources are extracted without, jump down. Natural resources are extracted without any benefits, as they continue to pay debts while resources benefit rich nations. That's a good point. How can the unequal relations be ended? So I'll throw that to you, Keston.
Should I answer, or should I wait for others?
Let me run it by you again, because I mean, I can answer.
No, I got it. I got what the question said. So in the case of the Bahamas actually is not a country that qualifies for aid, in part because based on, I think, a very odd metric that is used by the World Bank and the OECD Development Assistance Committee, I think, which is GDP per capita. Because the Bahamas has a small population, it generates a certain amount of economic output. Based on that metric, they do not qualify for concessional finance, which is aid. And so many of these countries actually do not qualify for aid. Let's put that out there. One. Second, and only receive, in some instances, after a major disaster, they receive a certain amount of support. But I want to make it clear that the issue around justice and climate justice cannot be based on aid. It can be based on charity, or what is considered charity in that sense. And aid is often tied to certain kinds of economic extractive activities and practices. So it often, I think, aid from the United Kingdom, for instance, is often tied to a certain number of consultants who do the job on projects that from which that aid is generated, or multinational investment coming alongside that particular aid, which is also an extractive activity. So it is not, I think the discussion around aid in the United States in the United Kingdom is so warped that many people think that it is that they're offering charity to other countries, but it's not charity. And it's not, if we consider aid, if we consider 500 years of extractive activity and environmental degradation.
Thanks, Keston. Yeah, I think I noticed some other questions, so we might loop back around to a similar theme. But moving a little bit with Anna's question, she says, what do you see as the role of corporations versus states when thinking about climate repatriations? Is the global enrichment of corporates a colonial dynamic, and how should they be compensated? Or how should they compensate, rather?
The role of corporations and states. So this, I think, well, one, I think corporations should be out of that scenario, in the sense that, apart from contributing things like technologies, renewable energy technologies, and so on, which can be regulated by the state in a particular country, I'm not seeing a particular role for business corporations, in part because many of their activities, in part, especially fossil fuel corporations, and sort of mining and other types of corporations that are actually involved in this extraction, I'm not sure that there's a role for them in terms of contributing to justice, climate justice, in part because their role is often around generating profit. And to make a point to add to that, it's that much of the climate finance activity and policy and global climate policy that we have seen over the past 5 years since the Paris Accord have integrated business activity and integrated investor and financial interest as part of addressing climate change. And that itself has also generated in part the increased debt that we're talking about, but it has also generated countries have profited from climate devastation. So that is the conundrum. Investors and financial interests in financial markets and so on have become integrated in the climate policy realm insofar as they have also, many international organizations have made them a priority and made private sector priority in addressing climate change, when their role have been actually to profit from devastation and loss and damage that countries have faced, insofar as they contribute debt and credit to these countries when they're found in difficulty.
Thank you very much, Keston.
So states, in terms of climate reparations, states have to be at the forefront of recognizing how they have contributed to this particular problem, and also recognizing how their extractive practices have also contributed to increased greenhouse gas emissions, especially in the case of the United States, Western Europe, and so have to make a pact at a global level, in my view, in terms of recognizing climate reparations is the way that they can resolve part of the problem, especially in the most vulnerable countries.
Excellent. Thank you, Keston. I think we've got time for just squeeze one more question in there. So this is posted. How can we address inequalities you highlight? What do countries need to do locally? Or is it a summit gathering like a UN COP26 to deal with this? Interesting one to finish on.
So, yeah, I think international institutions like the United Nations Framework on Climate Change, I don't think there has been any discussion. I mean, there have been a number of NGOs and activists and so on that have been putting this on the agenda in terms of climate debt, what they call climate debt. And they have been advocating for a number of years. So let me make that clear. In terms of countries paying climate debt. So they have made a big contribution. In terms of on the world scale and world stage, this definitely has to become part of a multilateral discussion. It has to become part of a broader look at inequality. So inequality due to the COVID-19 pandemic have become part of discussion globally. And inequality in terms of climate change, in terms of the prospect of climate refugees, it's a very real prospect and has been increasing from a number of countries that face climate devastation. We do have to have a very serious conversation around climate reparations and having that placed on globally, in my view.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So unfortunately, we have hit 11 o'clock, so we'd run a little bit over. There are a lot of interesting questions in there, so I believe we do have them saved. So maybe, Keston, if you don't mind, I'll maybe email a few to you, and we can maybe get a discussion on our LinkedIn group. But on behalf of everyone who's been watching, and myself as well, thank you, Keston, for joining us and sharing your knowledge and insights. definitely lots and lots to be thinking about. It'll be running through my brain for some time to come. Yeah, thank you very much, Keston. And
Thank you for having me. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks a lot. Take care.
All right, cheers.